Kimberlyn Leary began her career as a clinical psychologist, working as a practitioner to improve access to diverse communities. Her early work on negotiated transactions and psychotherapy expanded to broader research on negotiation, conflict transformation, and change management. She is an associate professor of psychology at the Harvard Medical School, McLean Hospital, and an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Professor Leary served as an advisor to the Obama White House from 2014 to 2016, working with the White House Council on Women and Girls to develop the Advancing Equity Initiative, which focused on improving life outcomes for women and girls of color, and in the public health branch of the Office of Management and Budget. She recently joined the Harvard Kennedy School as a lecturer in public policy and teaches courses on adaptive leadership, exercising authority, and leading teams. She's currently on a public services leave through June of 2020 and serving as the Senior Vice President of the Urban Institute. Kim, thank you so much for joining us today on this important topic. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Erica. And hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today and to take you inside, essentially, my classroom at the Kennedy School and also the School of Public Health. I've had the pleasure, if I could have the next slide, please, of teaching in several Harvard schools, the Kennedy School, the School of Public Health, and also at the medical school. And if you could click the slide, the next one, please. Also in several executive education programs throughout the university. My course, MLD 203, many of you may recognize as the third course in the adaptive leadership sequence. And I've had the pleasure for many years of working with Ronnie Heifetz, whom I imagine many of you know, and also co-teaching MLD 203 with Professor Heifetz, not this past year, but the year before. So what I'd like to do today is really talk some about how the MLD and adaptive leadership courses enable the learning of soft skills, and to make the case for why those soft skills are so absolutely critical to being able to exercise both leadership and authority, particularly under very extreme circumstances like what we're facing right now. If I could have the next slide, please. So we are at a moment right now where authority is in crisis, and we also need authority because we are in crisis. And one of the best ways to think about what's needed at this time, and again, this time includes so many different milestones, the beginning of the pandemic, then the onset of economic turbulence, and then most recently, the challenges of addressing racial injustice and structural racism. So if we think about at the moments where the crisis begins, the very first thing that we look to people in authority roles, is for some direction, protection, and order. And those are the very things that often people in authority roles are not able to deliver at that particular moment. So early on, if you think about the start of the pandemic, what you would hear from people in authority roles, sometimes in leadership roles as well, is the effort to stabilize their constituencies and buy time. And in order to do that, there are certain activities that authorities need to be able to engage. The first of these is to cultivate situational awareness. And very often in our adaptive leadership classes, we begin the class with a simple query: where are you now? And that is also a skill that is needed, I think, in running organizations and in speaking with constituencies of all kinds. It's also really critical, of course, to be able to be nimble, to be able to pivot to agile problem solving. And to do that, one needs to partner both up and down the authority chain and also across. And of course, we know those who have studied adaptive leadership or those who've been in authority and leadership roles, that typically you're not trying to adjudicate between good choice A and good choice B. There are tough trade-offs that need to be made and competing priorities. And critical to leadership, of course, and authority is the ability to communicate well, actively, empathically, and in ways that promote people engaging in useful action. So if I could have the next slide, please. So this is where we'll go today. I'm going to talk some about these soft skills. I'm going to talk also about the history, the prehistory, if you will, of adaptive leadership, which has some of its important roots in psychology. And then I'm going to try to take you inside my MLD 203 classroom to talk about how we teach and try to learn these soft skills in the context of adaptive leadership. And then we'll end, if we have time, at looking at some of the frontiers and where this work might go. If I could have the next slide, please. So one of the interesting dimensions of leadership studies and the call for more leadership in organizations is an increasing recognition that non-cognitive skills are really critical for success in the labor market. And my Kennedy School colleague, David Deming, has done research in this area. What he has shown is that jobs that require analytical reasoning and interpersonal facility both have grown at a much higher rate than all other jobs, if you look at longitudinal surveys. And job seekers need clearly quantitative skills, but they need relational skills in order to do the work that they're being asked to take on. And probably the most prized skill these days that employers are looking for are people who have the ability to work successfully in teams. And what's interesting about teamwork, and we might even think about our classrooms as a kind of temporary team, is that teamwork, in order to be executed well, requires good theory of mind skills. Theory of mind basically means the ability to appreciate the intention and mindset of others, especially when their intentions or mindsets are different from your own. So being able to have a view in your own mind of how other people are thinking is absolutely critical to being able to work successfully in teams and in organizations. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Thanks. So we talk about teamwork, we talk about relational skills, and we talk a lot about collaboration. And the reason that this is so important, particularly in the context of adaptive leadership, is if you're going to accomplish anything big, you really need other people. It's very difficult to promote large-scale change on your own. In fact, you can't do it. So the ability to learn how to work with people across different systems and in different roles is absolutely critical to being able to get important work done. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture you may not have seen before. It's of a bobtail squid, and I'll explain in a moment why I put it before you. You know, in much of the time, in the way we think about how people get along or how they get things done, we evoke an ethos of competition. And in science and in biology, we've often talked about perpetual competition, the survival of the fittest. But even our models of science are evolving. And increasingly, we recognize that survival, in a biological sense, is enhanced by mutually enriching symbiotic relationships. And that's where our friend, the bobtail squid, comes in. The bobtail squid, as you see, has a shimmering, luminescent blue bottom. And apparently this is very, very attractive to other bobtail squid. But what's interesting here is that the squid cannot produce that blue luminescence itself. It requires a bacterium. It has to be a host for a particular bacterium. And together, they're able to ensure their mutual survival. So this is just a good example to begin to explain why it's so important to think about collaboration. Next slide, please. So when we think about what's required to get things done, big things, it's important to recognize that there are ways to divide up the world and to divide up environments as kind environments and wicked environments. Kind environments are pretty straightforward, where you know what needs to be done and where you have the appropriate skills to execute. Wicked environments are the ones where, like the ones we're facing right now with COVID, the recession, and with racial unrest in this country and across the globe, where the problem looks different to different people and their key interdependencies, so that any intervention you make will reverberate through the system. In adaptive leadership terms, we call this distinction one between technical problems, where the problem is known and knowable, expertise exists, and if you can organize that expertise well and follow rules of the game, you can make progress. But if the problem or challenge is an adaptive one, as I mentioned, it looks different to different people, and learning and innovation is needed, not just expertise. And the learning takes place in a very unclear system where the rules are evolving and are context dependent. So, if I could have the next slide, please. It's also useful to think about power. And again, two broad distinctions of two types of power. Robert Dahl, the political scientist, talks about power as the ability to get someone or some group to do something they would not otherwise do. This is a power you might associate with an authority who is able to have the resources to compel others to get things done. But there's another type of power that's a part of authority, but also a part of leadership. And that comes from work done by Mary Parker Follett, who really was a visionary in organizational behavior and organizational scholarship. And she talks about the importance of being able to unleash the energy of a group in order to meet some desired ends. And to do that, you have to have the capacity to draw out from others their potentials. You have to be able to listen to a variety of voices and find some coherency across that multiplicity. And you have to be alert to new potentials and drawing out new values. So when we begin to think about kind of where we are in this world, you can see that soft skills are very critical to being able to exercise authority and respond to big challenges. If I could have the next slide, please. So let's talk about what kind of architecture enables engagement to learn soft skills in a degree program context or also in the context of executive education. So this is Winston Churchill, as you can see, and in 1942, Britain faced a very significant challenge. The war had decimated the ranks of the officer corps, and the British Army faced a critical shortage of the young men it believed were best suited for leadership, those from the upper classes who had traditionally served in those roles and who were referred to in the time as natural leaders. But the British Army turned instead to a psychiatrist, Wilfred Bion, and asked him to help them identify extraordinary qualities among ordinary recruits. And with this, the Army at that time made a crucial pivot from leadership as legacy to leadership as talent. So this is what Bion did. He took a group of recruits together and he studied how they organized themselves in groups, especially when they were given an ambiguous task to solve. And what he discovered is that the fittest candidates were those who could keep the group in mind while not, as he put it, quote, losing their own minds. So we begin to see what an architecture of engagement looks like. Putting people together in a setting where there's some task they have to accomplish together, and then looking to see what happens and trying to interpret the processes as they occur. Next slide, please. And this is actually now the core of what we mean by experiential learning, which the Kennedy School has begun to really prioritize in a variety of courses, from innovation field labs to some of our negotiation classes and to adaptive leadership and other leadership and management classes as well. So the loop begins with having some experience yourself, learning to reflect on it, conceptualizing it, and then being able to experiment and try out what you've learned, and then to transfer it from that learning context to some organization or execution context. That's the basic architecture of experiential learning. Next slide, please. So when we think about our classrooms or our organizations, what we see on top, if you will, the coordinated activity, occurs because of what's undergirding that activity. And we typically, in most contexts, when you give a group an ambiguous task, they will default to particular ways of responding to stress. And each group has its own default pattern. So the architecture of change, again, in an experiential course or experiential setting, is creating a platform for the group to learn to observe itself and then experiment with new options to improve its own productivity. Okay, next slide, please. So if that's the overall architecture for engagement, what does it look like in a classroom? And here, all of you who have had some engagement with the Kennedy School, either in our degree programs or executive education sessions, can begin to draw on your own recollections of those experiences as I begin to take you into my classroom. So next slide, please. In our classrooms today, we are seeking and desirous of a lot of diversity. And the Kennedy School in particular prides itself on being able to attract very diverse participants into its classrooms, virtual or otherwise. So we have diversity by program, by area of specialization. We aim for demographic diversity. We look for diversity by sector. We now have students who intend to go into the private sector, the social sector, as well as the public sector, or intend to move across sectors over the course of their careers. And we also, when you think about it from a learning point of view, we have classrooms that are diverse by learning style and expectation. Some students come to our classroom wanting the authority figure, the professor, to give them the answer. That's what they paid for, that's what they want. Others are looking to co-design a classroom experience with the professors and with their fellow students. And people are coming from different traditions around the world and with different intentions about where they'll take this work forward. That's what the classroom looks like. That's the group that we have to work with and the group that we want to engage in this process of coming to be able to observe itself and begin to experiment with moving its productivity forward. Next slide, please. So early in life, we all learn how to deal with authorities and how to navigate groups. We start doing that in our families. We do it in primary school, in clubs, in sports, all kinds of opportunities that we have to try out how do we influence others and how do we engage with them. But even though we all learn these skills, next, if you could click the slide, please, we don't all learn the same lessons. And that's what yields the kind of diversity that I was talking about. Next slide, please. So Sigmund Freud once said, and his entire theory is about the past being prologue, that our personal histories do a couple of things. They're, of course, the only experience that we have in the world. We only know the world we know. And so they shape what we recognize as valid. Who we listen to, who we're inclined to trust, who we think we should keep our distance from. We also develop emotional heuristics that are based on that experience. And we engage with one another with the relationship that we have in mind, and we try to recruit others to play complementary roles in our own dramas. That's essentially how our personal psychologies intersect with our group psychologies. Next slide, please. But here's the challenge, that what people learn may affect their willingness to learn in the future. Next slide. This is a wonderful study from social psychology, Adam Galinsky's work, where the essential research task was brought people into the lab, and he somehow set up a condition where they had to draw the letter E on their forehead. And in the context of the research study, people were quite willing to do that. But what he discovered is that through some pre-assessment that they did of participants, that people who experience themselves in high power roles or viewed themselves as having a lot of positional power wrote an E on the forehead that was commensurate with their own point of view. Whereas people who had less positional power and saw themselves as being less powerful overall would draw the E such that it was recognizable to someone else. So the histories that we have, we bring those into the classroom, and they are important to the drama that unfolds in all of our classrooms as we try to help people to learn to think about leadership. Next slide, please. And I'll ask you to click it a couple of times. And again, great. So, thanks. So we have diversity in our classrooms, and we have to create an environment where people can work together. You may have heard the term a holding environment, which also comes from psychology. A holding environment is a problem-solving space where you look to the vertical lines of trust from those who are in authority roles, in this case, professors and teaching fellows, on down. And you also are looking at horizontal bonds of trust across the classroom, the way in which people become meaningful to one another over the course of a semester or a few days in an executive education program. Our colleague at the business school, Amy Edmondson, calls this psychological safety. And in her view, psychological safety has evolved when people are willing to speak their minds and listen to others, but also they don't expect that they're going to be attacked for the points of view that they have. They expect to get a fair hearing, and it's an achievement of what a group or a team is able to do together. And when you have a holding environment, when psychological safety is possible, that's when you are most able to leverage the diversities in a classroom or in an organization towards the innovation that we know is possible when multiple perspectives are brought together and coordinated to solve complex problems. Next slide, please. So this is the map of my class and what it looks like. And again, Professor Heifetz and I worked together to take this class, which was originally taught in, I think, 1998 and 1999, and again in 2001, and then was not taught again until 2019. And we took the original frame of the class, expanded it, and then subsequently, when I was teaching the class last year, particularly this past spring, particularly as we had to go online and move from a residential classroom to a Zoom classroom, we had to innovate in real time as well. But this is the description of the class. We treat the large classroom as a temporary organization where, given that the class is exercising authority, we discuss and analyze authority dynamics that are happening out there in organizations that students have been a part of, in movements that we read about or happening in real time. And we also track in very critical ways the authority dynamics that are evolving in the classroom, using ourselves as a case in point. There are evening sessions on developing authoritative voice. And the best way I can succinctly describe what I mean by that is being able to speak in such a way that others are inclined to listen to you. We also use small groups, which you might think of as a kind of internal field lab, where students present their cases of authority failures, and they have a chance to think about the diagnostic errors that they made and consider new options for action should they face a comparable challenge ahead. There are also weekly reflection papers that include not just an analysis of the small group work, but expressive narratives where we ask students to talk about horizontal and vertical bonds of trust that they have experienced or failed to experience in their own lives. We've asked them to reflect on how they've been able to establish legitimacy and what their experience of power has been like. And we do a lot of reading. We're still figuring out how to include the readings in the class perhaps a bit more effectively than we have. But we use the readings in political and democratic theory, organizational behavior, history, and memoir to expand the base of information that we have as a group. So, the next slide, please. Many of you who've taken adaptive leadership classes know that when we think about leadership, we're talking about an activity and a choice that's available to anyone, whether or not they have authority. And this is really the critical lesson that comes from the first two MLD courses, MLD 201 and 202, where the first course looks at leadership from the outside in. The second course, some of you will know it as the January course, looks at leadership from the inside out. And MLD 203 looks at authority and draws on the learning from the previous two classes. If you could click on the slide. But as we begin to move from the study of leadership to the study of authority, we look at the constraints that exist on people who in authority roles, particularly when they're trying to practice leadership. Next slide, please. This graph will be also familiar to those of you who have taken adaptive leadership courses. It involves a very particular definition of authority, where authority consists of being entrusted with power and resources in exchange for providing a set of services. And those services typically include protection, direction, and order. By trust, we're talking about the qualities of competence, the values that you stand for or represent, and also the predictability that you display in organizational or classroom context. We also make a distinction between the job that you're authorized to do and you can fulfill, and where people in authority roles can go a bit further and fulfill the spirit of that job, not just the letter of what the job description entails. Now, the reason, of course, that leadership is difficult or more difficult to practice from an authority role is that people are looking to you to deliver those services, not just ask tough questions, even if tough questions need to be asked. They're looking for you, in essence, to make sure that the lights stay on, the paychecks are delivered, work is organized, and people are coordinating their activities towards whatever purpose is at hand. And when you're trying to also engage people in tough questions that have to do with how do we manage a pandemic or racial injustice, then you'll have to renegotiate some of those services if you're going to ask people to take up this kind of very difficult work that requires their cooperation and coordination, but where they don't view the work in the same way. They view the work differently depending on the constituency they represent, and so they view the solution differently as well. Next slide, please. So this is how we begin to think about the classroom environment. In the classroom, there are certain roles that are associated with formal authority, where formal authority is the result of being elected or selected. And the formal authority that you might think of with the classroom is the professor, and then the teaching fellows, course assistants, course coaches. But because we also have designated authorities in our case discussions on the second class of each week, some students, a subset of students, will also have an opportunity to be in front of the class and to have a role as a formal authority in leading the class discussion. But we're also tracking over the course of the case in point, as well as the plenary class discussions, the informal authority dynamics in the class. And informal authority is that which is not conferred by being elected or selected, but by the credibility that you are able to have with peers and in the system, with the respect that you generate because of your values, and the implicit service you provide, which may well be because you take up a point of view or a perspective that is meaningful to some group or some subset of the class or your organization. If you could click again, please. So for instance, in a conversation where we're presenting a case or someone's presenting a case talking about charter schools and the challenges of working with kids in communities that are furthest from opportunity. A fellow student who has experience either with charter schools themselves, or maybe they know something about trauma-informed learning, or perhaps they've had a personal experience with learning disabilities, and they add something to the classroom conversation. You can see their informal authority rise in that system. You can't really see it, but you can feel it in the classroom, and you can chart that people turn to them, they nod in agreement with them, they index their future comments against what that person has said. If you could click again, please. And again. But say you have a student who is responding to this discussion about charter schools and kids furthest from opportunity, and they have a side issue or a preoccupation that they want to introduce into the class. Maybe they want to talk about technology in education, but if it's not germane to the work that that group is doing, they may well be minimized or ignored, or at the worst, what we call assassinated, using that metaphorically. And so we can begin to track and talk about and interpret who has informal authority in the classroom and how did they get it, and who's lost informal authority and how can they restore it. Okay, next slide, please. And the next slide. Okay, great. So when we try to put together a map to help our students understand how this might be something that they can track in the settings that they're in, we invite them to think about formal authorities and to map the authority system, and to also look at informal authority. And of course, someone can be high in formal authority, can be a course coach who also has gained a lot of credibility with the class. And those are the kinds of teachers and the kinds of course coaches where a class or in an organizational context, people will follow with their whole heart. You know, you are providing them with a service, you have the resources to do that, but you also represent something that's important to them. You can also have a lot of formal authority, but low informal authority. You know, you do your job, you provide the services that have been expected, but not much more than that. And in such an instance, people may still follow you to the letter of their jobs, to the extent that they're obliged to do so, but not much more. And of course, there are many places in life where people see a problem and they organize others on behalf of it, and they have a lot of informal authority and are able to, but not much formal authority, and they're able to mobilize others on behalf of a shared cause. And sometimes you can see that in the classroom, a cause that gets adopted and carried forward. And we also try to help our students with this last quadrant that is perhaps the most challenging of all, where one doesn't have formal authority and one doesn't yet have the capacity to build one's informal authority. And this is challenging because, of course, at such moments, one feels and is invisible to others and largely irrelevant to the work that's being done. So we want to help students go from places of low informal authority to being able to meaningfully, intentionally engage their informal authority, and to recognize that that's a set of skills that they can practice in the classroom and carry forward. Next slide, please. Now, we take this up a lot in looking at how students respond to authority figures, looking to how they respond to me as the faculty member at the front of the room, or to course coaches, or occasionally we've brought in guests. We had a couple of heads of state last year who came into the authority class. So we look at how students and invite them to observe how they are engaging with authority. And even though most of the students who come to the Kennedy School or to our executive education programs and adaptive leadership experience themselves, and they are global change agents, we have noticed, Professor Heifetz and I, that there are certain default relationships with respect to authority that you see quite frequently. Few of our students at the beginning of the semester were in a real position to collaborate with us as the authority figures. Instead, they arrived prepared to struggle with us, to struggle with the teaching team, to struggle with the class, the way it was organized, and so forth. So it seemed to us that there were two modes that we saw most of the time. People would either rebel in the face of an authority and ultimately try to exit, or they would submit and defer. And in the classroom, what we're trying to do is capture that dynamic, draw it to the student's attention, and then begin to open that binary so that there are many more opportunities between submission and exit for them to occupy as choice points. So if I could have the next slide, please. What we learned is that many of our students haven't really thought before about the middle position. And this is a quote from a student about a year ago who said in the student's experience that one could either be obedient or a troublemaker. This particular student grew up in a patriarchal household where respect was granted to elders, and the student started to notice that the father of the student obeyed the grandparents, and even after the grandparents had passed away, their word, the father's loyalty to his parents went on. And this for her was a really critical observation. Next slide, please. So when we open up that spectrum, the authority spectrum, we can see that in addition to submitting or deferring to authority or rebelling or exit, there are all kinds of other possibilities. Partnering with authority, negotiating with authority, challenging it, questioning it, and so on. And these are all points on the authority spectrum that have come from our students, from their essays, from their class discussions. Next slide, please. Now I want to identify a particular challenge that comes up in the classroom. Remember I said earlier that we all learn how to deal with authorities early in life, but we don't all learn the same things. And so when you have a possibility of potentially partnering with authority, that may or may not be possible for all. Imagine, if you will, a scenario where the authority in a given organization is a senior male, and you happen to be a young woman. It may not feel to you, based on the ways in which you've had experiences, say, with being mistreated by authority in general, or mistreated in particular ways that are close to or actual sexual assault, or you know that your voice and your work and your labor is not respected as equally as male counterparts. The opportunities for partnership then don't look precisely the same. Next slide, please. So when we invite students to think about how to partner with authority, we recognize that they have to encounter their own loyalties and understanding of what's safe and what's not, and begin to think about how they can challenge themselves. It also means that people have to take risk. And in a classroom that has an effective holding environment, students are willing to take that risk, especially if they understand what has interfered with their ability to do so up until the present moment. Next slide, please. Now, because this is a class on authority, we also are trying to prepare our students for when they're in formal authority roles themselves. And here there's also a spectrum. Our students come in either anticipating that if they are in an authority role, they'll have to be permissive in ways that many recognize may not actually fit the purpose at hand, or they may expect that they have to be harsh and authoritarian. And gradually, as they reflect on the work in the classroom and through their own essays, they begin to identify other ways that authority figures, that they can engage others as an authority figure, and begin to think about where they might want to place themselves, where they might want to experiment. If they're used to being supportive and offering solutions, how could they coach others instead, as an example? Next slide, please. So the first time that Professor Heifetz and I taught this class together, we convened some focus group conversations during the summer. And we have another set of focus group conversations that I have with my teaching team that we're convening at the end of August, early September. We're a little bit later because of the everything that's been happening. But what we learned from students who were in the focus group were a couple of important things that they told us the class had helped them to examine their assumptions about authority. Some had, and we knew this, been scarred by authority. They'd experienced violations of all kinds, but they felt they had an experience in a classroom like that to work on key issues. Others learned that the world is not a safe place, and our students this semester very much felt that quite keenly in the face of the pandemic. But they also felt that the classroom was like the real world, and people had to decide what risk they were willing to take. And ultimately, that becomes a matter of one's personal choice. I think the most important learning to come out of this particular semester, in my view, was that students recognized that when they were triggered by their classmates, that it was the beginning rather than the end of a story, and that they need to learn to ask more and figure out how to better understand what's going on in the minds and hearts of others. And because we experimented with bringing in guests, I mentioned we had one mayor and two former heads of states, one student observed that guests allowed us to see authority challenges in the wild and how the class responded to celebrities, and to observe the power that even in a class in authority, that students were automatically conferring on these luminaries. So next slide, please. So mapping frontiers, I'm just going to say one thing about that. Next slide. So this is Mayor LaToya Cantrell, who many of you may know because she is the mayor of New Orleans right now. But before she was the mayor of New Orleans, she was on the city council. And before that, she became part of the movement in Broadmoor, a neighborhood in New Orleans, which coincidentally my family is from, that was very heavily affected by Hurricane Katrina. So Mayor Cantrell was working with neighbors on the recovery from Katrina, and began in that way to start on what was ultimately a journey that led to her having a formal authority role. But she moved from having high informal authority in her community to being able to then move into a position of formal authority where she reflects on the constraints that exist as well as the resources at her disposal. And this is the kind of story that we try to capture for our students, because we know very many of them will go from roles where they have very significant informal authority, and they have to figure out how they will work their own capacities, their own hungers within more formal structures, and when all eyes are on them to solve problems that they will need to figure out how to coordinate with others in order to bring about effective results. So let's stop there, and I'd welcome any of your questions or comments.
Our first question is asking about being a good influencer in Colombia, where corruption has invaded all areas of government. So,
well, that's a terrific question. I think I can speak generally about the issue of corruption, which comes up quite frequently in the authority classes. You know, an authority system that includes corrupt activities is the source of many violations of trust. And many of us, when I ask the question in my class, how many of you have experienced a violation of trust by an authority figure or know of someone who has, 100% of the hands go up. So it's a difficult question to answer about how to influence in the context of corruption. I would say that the most important thing is to recognize that it's very difficult for people to lead with trust when they have every reason not to. And being thoughtful and mindful, and recognizing that that mistrust gets passed down generationally, creates an opportunity for people to examine if the new situation they're in warrants the distrust of the past, and what kind of work, personal work and organizational group work, would they have to do in order to open themselves up to the risk of trying to see where change is possible.
Great, thank you. We have a follow-up question on Mayor Cantrell. Did she lose any of her informal authority when she took formal authority, or was she viewed as trading the cause or leaving the cause?
Yes, great question. And the case study that we used was a new one from the Kennedy School. It's a video case study. So in addition to text, we actually have, it includes, it's an online case study, the mayor reflecting on her own experience of leadership and authority, but also others in the city of New Orleans, people from the Broadmoor community to those who were on city council with her. As in all of these matters, it depends on who you ask and how you ask, but certainly the mayor was, as all people are in a role of formal authority, was looked at in a very different way. She did not have the same degrees of freedom when she had to represent all of the city of New Orleans, as opposed to the constituencies most affected by Hurricane Katrina in her home neighborhood.
We have a question around soft skills. How do we avoid the influence of those who are good at soft skills when we can't agree with them? For instance, if we cannot agree with the idea or project, but there's pressure to agree or work with them because they're very good at influencing others.
Right. Yeah, it comes down to, in a way, how can you begin to create a platform where people can coordinate their skills, and where you sharpen your capacity to listen to where you can be supported by X constituency or Y constituency, and where they won't be able to join you. And that reading of the room, reading of the organization, that diagnostic set is among the most critical soft skills. You know, you can try this out yourself, and we recommend that students do this. In any meeting you happen to be in, to think about who, when someone is speaking and advocating or claiming something, who are they representing as far as you can tell? Whose voice do you hear echoed in theirs? And if it's unfamiliar, which it probably will be, what would you have to do in order to learn more about why they're taking the position or perspective that they are? And it's very difficult to do that. And yet, when you're in an authority role, perhaps even more, in addition to a leadership role, it's absolutely critical to understand the firepower, if you will, that you have by being able to use people well, which includes understanding their perspectives, especially on the issues where they differ from you.
Great, thank you. We have a question about what role do you see executive presence and emotional intelligence play in soft skills for leaders?
I think very key. You know, if you think about informal authority as including elements of emotional intelligence, can you listen to others well? Can you express yourself clearly? Can you stay calm in the face of being triggered or provoked? Very critical to being able to maintain or to grow informal authority. In fact, our students often find that over the course of a semester, the ability to listen to people you disagree with is the skill that grows the most. It doesn't mean at the end of the day you're on the same page, but you have acquired the presence of mind, one might say, in order to take in the information that they're sharing with you that may very likely be necessary to solve whatever problem is collectively before you.
I have a question about how do you build back informal authority and move toward great team outcomes after circumstances have caused stress or loss of trust on a team and leadership.
Yeah. So if we were in the classroom together right now, or we were in interactive Zoom rather than a webinar, I would ask you, when have you seen that where it's been done well? You might even think about your own experience where you've said something that didn't land well with others. What enables the next 10 minutes or the next 10 hours, the next 10 days for you to return to the game, if you will, and to make it possible to be heard again? You know, I would say that part of it is taking in the message of why you lost authority in the first place. Were you speaking to a side issue? Were you really pushing something that was preoccupying to you? Were you just not in the flow of it? Were you trying to divert the group? That can be an important thing for someone to learn. Also, I think in an experience where there's a lot of pressure, you say the wrong thing, whatever that may be, and often we take ourselves out of the game. We're embarrassed, or we feel that we don't have a right any longer to have the floor. And this is especially the case, I would say, with some groups of students who may have been raised to believe that authority went to folks who didn't look like them, and that they feel that they can't make mistakes. If they make a mistake, they feel like it's game over. We try to help people to realize that learning always involves being at the edge and the frontier of your own competence. That learning publicly in a classroom, learning in a webinar, learning where you're in front of other people who have perspectives on what you're doing or what you're not doing, is the ideal venue to be able to practice getting your voice back in order to enter into problem solving again with colleagues.
We have a question about how adaptive leadership relates to values. Would you consider it value neutral if theoretically possible? And if not, how would you identify its underlying values or value system?
Yeah. I think there are values that are a part of the adaptive leadership framework. There is a value in learning, for example. And a value in learning means that other goals or aspirations may need to be abandoned in a classroom setting. You know, one of the things the Kennedy School does well, and I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School myself about 10, 12 years ago, is saying when you come to one of our classes, an executive ed class or to a degree program, that you can come representing your home constituency. You can come with a goal of trying to convert others to whatever issue is important to you. But that may not be the best way to spend your time, because you have an opportunity not just to convince others or to advocate, but to actually learn. And learning means taking risk, taking measured risk, and being able to take ever more thoughtful and calculated risks going forward. So there's certainly a value in adaptive leadership about learning. I would say that other values are about purpose, that the collective problems that are organized around a purpose that benefit humanity in different ways is embedded in an adaptive leadership context. You can mobilize people on behalf of a cause that may be a negative one that results in an intention to cause pain and suffering. That's not the goal of an adaptive leadership perspective, even though we know those kinds of circumstances take place, and we do our best to analyze them so that we can make sure we don't fall prey to whatever temptations got us there, got those folks there in that particular circumstance.
So we have a question from someone who is working to grow soft skills in their business settings, but the term seems to have developed a tired or negative connotation. So is there an emerging synonym that could help us create more comfort about growing soft skills in business environments?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So the new terminology, which I'm not sure it's that much better, but it is different, non-cognitive skills. So when I referred to David Deming's work, he was talking about the market for non-cognitive skills, and teamwork, and being able to work in teams is considered an example of a non-cognitive skill. So it involves emotional intelligence, relational capacity, the ability to negotiate, the ability to communicate. All of those clearly involve the mind and the brain, so they're cognitive in that respect, but they're not about analysis per se. It's a different kind of analysis applied to understanding human cognition and understanding human needs and understanding how to bring people together in the service of collective aims.
One last question, I think, because we're just about out of time. So how often does informal authority lead to formal authority?
I don't have an answer for that, but it is not uncommon, right? If you are influential in a context and you're implicitly delivering services, and again, by services we mean protection, direction, order, or you stand for a value that's important, that gets recognized. It's not uncommon that might lead you to nominate yourself for a more formal authority role. You might run for something or apply for something. And it may also be that your work gets recognized and you're tapped, if you will, for a formal authority role. So you might say, what does it matter what happens in a classroom about who has high informal authority or who doesn't? It's an incubator. It's an opportunity for people to practice skills that when they're deployed in the service of problems in organizational and other settings can lead them to take on new challenges. And given the challenges that are in play right now, we need all the talent we can get.